Welcome to Practice Growth, the podcast that combines business and wellness to help you do your very best as a therapist. Get ready to learn from seasoned clinicians about self-care, therapy, and running a business. Now, here's your host, Stephen Quinlan.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Practice Growth. So glad that you decided to join us today. Today is a very special episode, and we are lucky enough to have Dr. Anna Lembke join us today. Dr. Lembke is the chief of Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis at Stanford University. She is the author of two books, the first of which on the opioid epidemic in the United States is called Drug Dealer MD, How Doctors Were Duped, Patients Got Hooked, and Why It's So Hard to Stop. Her new book is a New York Times bestseller called Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence, and was released in August of 2021. Dr. Lembke got her undergraduate degree at Yale University, and she earned her MD at Stanford School of Medicine. She has delivered expert testimony to legislators around the opioid epidemic, and she also appeared in the 2020 Netflix documentary called The Social Dilemma, in which she argued about how social media is a drug and exploits the purported evolutionary need for interpersonal connection. So there's a lot to learn here today from Dr. Lembke. Even if you don't have any issues with drugs or alcohol, which are, of course, usually the prime suspects around addiction, there may be other things in your life which you might be unaware of, which may be impacting you in a negative fashion. Dr. Lembke has a special interest in smartphones and screen time and parenting and all these other things that are constantly grabbing for our attention these days and pulling us away from being present with either our work or our families. You'll hear how also she relates her own story of addiction, which is outside of that typical drug and alcohol realm, and she does so very bravely in her book and also with us here today. And I have to say, on a personal note, I found her willingness to be so open and share to be very inspirational for me to also share my own story, which you may have not heard in the previous solo episode prior to this one. If you haven't had a chance, definitely go back and check that out. So today's episode is definitely focused on the wellness side of things, but as always, I think it's critically important that we take care of ourselves so that we can be able to continue to manage to grow our businesses in a way that feels sustainable and that isn't going to be untenable in the long run. I'm definitely living proof of this, and certainly something that I want to pass along to other clinicians out there, because we need you. The world needs you. So hopefully this is helpful, and I want to send a special thank you again to Dr. Lembke for taking the time out of her busy schedule to join us today. So here is the interview. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did, and I hope you can connect to Dr. Lembke's openness and authenticity, which are matched perhaps only by her clinical acumen and heartfelt presence. Enjoy. Well, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate your time, and I'm just really excited to talk with you.
Well, I'm so excited to be here too. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And I really enjoyed your latest book, which is Dopamine Nation, and I want to kind of get into some of that. But I thought maybe we could start with just kind of a general overview of like your career arc, maybe starting with kind of what you're doing today and what you're really excited about, and then taking us back to where things kind of started out for you and how you got to where you are.
Sure. Well, I'm a practicing psychiatrist. I work at Stanford. I'm on the faculty. I'm professor in the Department of Psychiatry and also medical director of addiction medicine and chief of our addiction medicine dual diagnosis clinic. So I spend my professional time seeing patients, most often together with residents and fellows.
Mhm.
So teaching them how to see patients with addiction and co-occurring psychiatric disorders. And then I also have my sort of research and scholarly work, and I do a lot of service work, a lot of educational presentations that I've done sort of as I consider that to be part of my service role. And that's also part of why I'm here today.
Mhm.
Yeah, so that's what I'm doing now.
So you're also like, which I noticed in the book, I mean, you're a psychotherapy practitioner, right? Which is perhaps
Yeah.
a little bit different than most psychiatrists.
Yeah, so I love that. It's so crazy that like that's the image of psychiatrists today, but I get
Mhm.
it.
Mhm.
Because there's this idea that psychiatrists just push pills and
Mhm.
psychologists and others do the psychotherapy, but psychiatrists do psychotherapy too. And
Yes.
many, if not most of us, were drawn to the field because of wanting to have these enduring relationships through time with our patients and actually engage in these deep conversations about psychology and what makes us tick and how to intervene. So yes, definitely, I do psychotherapy. I also prescribe meds. It's so funny because when I first went into psychiatry, like that was what psychiatrists did. They did psychotherapy, and there was a little bit of meds, but it was mainly psychotherapy. But of course, in the last 30 years, the field has really changed. And you're absolutely right. Now, there's this real separation where a lot of psychiatrists don't really do that kind of deeper talk therapy.
Yeah, I suppose that's unfortunate in a way for those who maybe were drawn to the profession, as you were saying, by wanting to have those profound relationships and conversations, and then things just shifting into this like division of labor that we have now, which is you do the meds and you do the therapy.
You're absolutely right. There's like this kind of a mourning process with that. And now with almost all of mental health going on Zoom, I find I'm like in a new mourning process where I'm
Yeah.
like, oh my gosh, is this now going to be the future of mental health, that we're not actually going to meet our patients in real life? And I think it is.
Yeah.
I don't think we're going back. I think this is the new normal. And of course, I think it can be very effective, and it's possible to have these really, intimate relationships, on telehealth,
Mhm.
but it's still not the same as meeting in person.
Right. Right. Yes, it's kind of this facsimile of what you would get with somebody who's there in the office. And there are, I think, for convenience sake, there's a lot of positives to it.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
lots of good reasons for it, but still not exactly what I signed up for.
yeah.
And I'll be curious to see, what the costs are, because there are going to be some costs or some downsides.
Yeah. And I'm curious about, speaking of sort of these general trends that are happening in society. And I know your book is a lot about this idea that instant gratification has taken the place of self-care in a lot of ways. And I
Yes,
know that a lot of the reason for even my doing this podcast is because as mental health practitioners, we are certainly not immune to the effects of that, and perhaps even
of
more
course.
so than
Mhm.
the general population. But sometimes I feel like there's this idea that you should be sort of somehow above that or something.
Yeah,
uh,
yeah, yeah. Interesting idea. I hadn't occurred to me that mental health care providers might be more vulnerable to
mm,
some of the ills of technology. But I do, certainly in the realm of like social media, I
mm,
think that might be possible, because I think that people who go into mental health self-select for people who are attachment oriented,
mm,
and who really want to connect on a deep level with other people. And of course, social media is potentially a way to drugify human
yeah,
connection.
right.
And so it's funny, because it might be true that maybe people in the mental health field are more prone to addiction to social media than other types of people. as you know, and as I talk about in my book, I thought I was immune to the problem of addiction because drugs and alcohol have never done much for me until I discovered romance novels and got addicted to those through my Kindle, which really, blindsided me in midlife. But wow, yeah, you might have hit on something there in terms of like mental health care providers, who I also think are kind of natural codependents, and the risks of getting addicted to attachment-oriented drugs, which I would include, social media, but also things like romance novels or other products that kind of simulate human attachment.
Yeah. Well, this is great. Now I can start my research paper. I think I've got that. Really
Seriously,
here.
I think you might be onto something.
Yeah. Well, it is. I mean, that's the basis of these things like Facebook and, any, pick your poison, right. With the social media stuff, but it does play off of what we as social creatures have naturally wired into us.
Yes.
But your addiction with the romance novels, while I think on some level feels maybe sort of different than, as you mentioned, somebody who has, drug and alcohol issues, it's really the same. It's the same, but different. Yeah. And I just want to say too, that I really appreciated how open and vulnerable you were about that, because
thank you.
I just find that really inspiring as somebody in recovery myself. And as it's difficult to talk about that.
Yes.
I think in the general public, even though stigma is different now than it used to be, there still is some fear around that. So I just personally appreciated that. And I'm sure that resonated with a lot of people as well.
Oh, thank you for your gratitude. Yeah. It was really scary to be open about that. But I include a lot of the stories of my patients with their consent.
Yeah.
And I felt like, I can't ask my patients, to share their stories and not be willing to share my own. But it is really fascinating how every time I talk about it, I feel shame. Like I'm in, it's like a burden every time, it's like, oh God, I hear, and which is so interesting and just really must be deeply hardwired, right? The shame that comes up, to talk about. I think it's also, especially maybe as a physician, because we're supposed to be the healers,
right?
Have it all together.
Exactly.
So it's always like, oh God, how's that going to be for people?
Right.
But people have been so wonderful. They received it so well. And like you have, felt gratitude that I was willing to share. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny too. You delineated different types of shame in the book, which I thought was really interesting. But no matter what, all these things that we already know, especially being in the profession that we're in, around being vulnerable and being authentic, and as you talked about, the importance of telling the truth and how that kind of counterintuitively actually draws people closer to you rather than pushing them away. We still feel that shame comes from somewhere.
I have come to believe that shame is hardwired, that it's instinctive, and that it's fundamentally pro-social, which is to say that it is the emotion that keeps the tribe together. Right? What happens is that in any social group, in order to survive and get along, that social group has to come up with norms of behavior. And anybody who's on the fringes of those norms or deviates from those norms, shame is the emotion that brings them back into the fold. And essentially, it's like Mother Nature's self-corrective emotion, because the experience of shame is so painful that we would do a lot to avoid it, right? And so it's the wanting to avoid the experience of shame that has us changing our behaviors. Now, where we get into trouble with this is if we avoid shame by lying about what we've done, and that actually then drives and perpetuates behavior. And we live in a society now where it's very easy to lie about what you're doing. There's enormous anonymity and isolation. Thousands, millions of years ago, it was really hard to lie about how you were spending your time. People were, always together doing the same things. So you couldn't really get away with it the way you can now. And I think that it's that ability to lie and the anonymity and the isolation and fundamentally the lying that, that then perpetuates the behavior and contributes to the ongoing isolation and the ongoing addictive behaviors.
I 100% agree with that. And we know that this is kind of pulled from, I don't know if you Johann Hari's work a little bit about like the addiction is, it's the opposite of connection, that it wants to drive you to this place of being by yourself. Yet part of the way of working yourself out of that is by connecting with other people. And of course, as we were saying earlier, in order to do that, there's that sharing component that has to be part of the puzzle somewhere.
Yeah, you have to kind of take that, leap of faith that when you tell people, when we tell people like what we've actually been doing, that they won't run screaming from us. And they almost never do, right? That's the thing. We think they will, but but instead they're like, oh man, me too, right? Or I got this, or Yeah.
Tell me about that for you. I'm curious, when you were writing the book, or when you decided to write the book and be as open as you were about your own struggles, what was that process like for you, and how were you able to kind of push past all of these things that we're talking about?
Thank you. What a great question. Nobody's ever asked me that. Well, first of all, I think I did it in real life before writing it in the book. I did it in real life in small increments, right? A kind of gradual sharing here and there, kind of testing the waters. Also, I've had the good privilege of working with these amazing people in recovery from severe addictions who have taught me so much, including, their journey of recovery and the incredible process that they went through and their awakening to the importance of, what I call in the book, radical honesty, or truth telling in all things large and small. And so I had, that it's funny when you're a mental health, provider, and you see patients over time, it's almost like you live 100,000 different lives, right? Because you're so immersed in their lives, through the dialogue, that it's like you lived that life. And so I feel like I've really kind of benefited. This is terrible because like I should be helping my patients, but really I feel like they've helped me. And so I had that kind of as like a sort of a context or a womb in which to process my own unexpected compulsive, overconsumption of this kind of what started out as romance novels and then progressed to erotica and, other compulsive activities. Let's just leave it at that.
Yeah, fair enough.
So, I kind of tested the waters on that. And then I guess I just felt I'd had so many experiences just in my own life where when I was willing to share the ways in which that I am flawed and broken, gosh, it was so powerful, right?
Yeah.
So powerful for me, for others, fostered intimacy, engendered trust. And so I know intellectually and from personal experience that that's what happens. So I just took this leap of faith and I thought, even if I put this on the page, I think people will understand it and hear it in the way that I mean it to be heard. And they really have. I mean, of course, I don't hear from the people who don't like it, but in general, so it's a biased sample, but in general, people have been just so positive about the book, but especially about my willingness to share. And also, I've read so many doctor authored books where like, after you're done reading them, you think like, my goodness, that doctor just walks on water. Like, geez,
Yes.
who am I? I'm some schmuck over here.
Right.
So I just thought, wow, maybe it would be refreshing to get a doctor authored book where it's like, wow, that person's messed up.
Well, it absolutely is. And it doesn't come across, that you're messed up. I think that what comes across is that you're a human being, right?
Yes.
Which of
Thank
course
you.
we all are, and
Yeah.
deeply flawed in our
Yes.
own ways. And this, in my own experience too, there's this parallel process that will happen with your clients or your patients if you let it. Because I remember very distinctly having this thought. I was leaving work one day, and it was working at a group practice, and I thought, wow, I was having all these kind of like ruminative thoughts about the people that I had seen, and something would sort of pop up in my head. Like there was, you'd see this and think of them. And I thought, man, people are paying me to essentially like rent out space in my head. And I had this reaction to it, which was like, I got to get them out of there. And I got to like essentially anesthetize myself to that.
Yeah.
So, and for me, it was very much like cannabis was the thing that did that for me. So, but now 6+ years of total abstinence from everything, what's happening is this growth that comes in, that is we all have, and that's all there. And as you talked about too, like it's part of our nature as human beings. If we're not growing, if you're not growing, you're dying, right? Like, so if you let that in, there's such an opportunity there.
Yes.
And what wonderful work that we get to do to be able to be a part of that.
Oh my gosh. Yes, I absolutely agree. It's such an honor, right? And such a gift that people let us into the most intimate aspects of their lives. And, of course, as you described, there can be fear there, right? Fear certainly on their end, like, can I trust this person? But maybe also, on our end, like, gosh, if I really let this in, what is it going to do to me, type thing. But I'm so glad that you found your way past running away from that. And you realized how capacious your mind actually is, that you can hold, the universe, really.
Yeah. It doesn't matter. Like it's no kind limit. It's that scarcity mindset. I think
that's right. Right. You got out of that scarcity mindset.
Yeah. Right. Or thinking that you're somehow not able to manage these things.
Right. That you can't hold it.
Right. Exactly. Another thing I wanted to touch on, which I found just really fascinating from the book, was your idea of these gremlins that hop in, who, if you weigh things down too heavily on the pleasure side, then they start bumping down on the pain side.
Yeah.
Which I'll let you explain a little bit. And then I have a couple of kind of follow-up things around that.
Okay, great. Yeah. So this is the neuroscience of addiction, which there's been amazing work done in the last 50 to 100 years. And sort of this is me sort of using an extended metaphor of a balance, like a teeter-totter in a kid's playground, and gremlins to sort of condense the last 100 years of the neuroscience of pleasure and pain. And to me, one of the most interesting findings is that pleasure and pain are co-located in the brain. So the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain. And it doesn't matter what medium you use to look at it, EEGs, PET scans, fMRIs, animal models, people are finding the same thing. And that pleasure and pain work like opposite sides of a balance. So when we do something pleasurable, the balance tips one way. Do something painful or experience pain, it tips the other. But one of the overarching rules governing this balance is that it wants to be level. It doesn't want to be tilted for very long to pleasure or pain. And our brains will work very hard to restore a level balance with any deviation from neutrality. And the way that our brains do that is to adapt. So when we do something pleasurable, we get a little release of dopamine in the brain's reward pathway. That's our pleasure neurotransmitter. And that balance tilts to the side of pleasure. But no sooner has that happened than our brain adapts by downregulating dopamine production and transmission. And I imagine that is these little neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. But the gremlins like it on the balance, so they don't get off right when it's level. They stay on until it's tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. And that's the come down, the after effect, the hangover, or even just a more subtle, moment of wanting to watch another YouTube video or play another, watch another Netflix episode, have another piece of chocolate, right? It manifests all over in our lives. Reach for our phone again to see, if we got another message. If we wait long enough, that gremlin hops off and balance, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis, is restored. But if we continue to expose ourselves to highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, we essentially accumulate enough gremlins on the pain side of the balance to fill this whole room. And that is the addicted brain. That means that we have essentially changed our hedonic or joy set point. We are now walking around with a balance chronically tilted to the side of pain. We're in a dopamine deficit state, right? Because we've told our body, hey, stop making dopamine. I'm getting all this other stuff from outside. And when that happens, now we need to continue to use just to feel normal and level the balance. And when we're not using, we are gripped by this overwhelming physiologic urge, which is withdrawal, which is characterized, the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance are not physical symptoms. They're in fact these psychological symptoms of anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and intrusive mental preoccupation with our drug of choice. So that's essentially what happens, and why it is, I think, that we as individuals and as nations are more depressed and anxious. I don't think it's because of childhood trauma or, income inequality, or all those things that you will read about more often. Of course, those can play a role. But really what I think is that we have too much of the wrong kinds of material goods, and that we've changed our hedonic set point and we're in a dopamine deficit state. And now we're reaching for those, goods, whether they're online or in real life, just to kind of get out of this dopamine deficit state and feel normal for a while.
Yeah. It speaks to, I think, that broader, more macro issue of how is it that we're so much better off that we've been at any point in human history.
Yeah.
We're supposedly so much more connected via all of these devices and internet. And yet we feel more kind of cut off from each other.
Yes. More despair.
And more despair. And we know what the rates of mental health issues look like. And so sometimes I think there's confusion around that. Where is this coming from? What is this?
Right.
But I think your work really illustrates where, it makes sense to me where these feelings would be coming from.
Yeah.
And the compulsive kind of reaching and grasping for something.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah. And when I looked at the epidemiologic data, I mean, what's so tragic, rates of not just depression, anxiety, but also suicide are rising all over the world and are directly correlated with socioeconomic status of the country. So the richer the nation, the higher the rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide. And also, frankly, the more access people have to standard mental health interventions like psychotropic medications, the higher the rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide. So we're clearly getting something fundamentally wrong here about how we're both understanding and intervening, in this mental health crisis. And that's really where I hope Dopamine Nation, will shed some light that really, it's the drugification of our dopamine saturated environment in this hyper convenient world that's actually making us all more vulnerable to addiction, making us all more unhappy.
It's so counterintuitive, isn't it?
Yes.
That you would think that as you have more access to these services or these psychotropics, whatever, that those rates would go down.
Yeah.
But it's the opposite.
Yeah.
So, which is kind of another segue, I think, into this homeostasis idea, that you had another chapter that was on the flip side of that, which is actually pushing on your pain lever and what happens when you do that. I thought this actually before you went, when I wrote down a question. I was like, I wonder what happens when you push on the pain lever, because something that I've noticed from my own life is that when I do something like, particularly with exercise, and I push myself in some way that's uncomfortable, I always feel better afterwards.
Oh, I know. Isn't that wild? Yeah. So those gremlins, they're agnostic for the initial stimulus. So if the initial stimulus is pleasure, they'll hop on pain. But if the initial stimulus is pain, they will hop on the pleasure side and ultimately reset our pleasure-pain balance to the side of pleasure. So there's real wisdom there, right? What that means is that if we intentionally engage in activities that are painful, and I mean physically painful as well as emotionally painful, we actually trick our bodies into upregulating dopamine production and our other feel-good hormones and neurotransmitters, like our endogenous cannabinoid system, our endogenous opioid system, serotonin, norepinephrine. And there's tons of evidence to support this. So there's an enormous amount of evidence, for example, that when we engage in exercise, over the course of exercise, dopamine levels slowly ramp up and remain elevated for hours afterwards. Mm-hmm. Ice cold water immersion. Over the course of ice cold water immersion, dopamine levels slowly ramp up and remain elevated for hours afterwards. Contrast that with an intoxicant where you get a huge release of dopamine in the reward pathway all at once, followed by plummeting levels as our brains, reeling from that excess, try to compensate, so that dopamine is then pushed into a deficit state below baseline levels before hopefully, going back to baseline, assuming we abstain from that intoxicant long enough to allow homeostasis to reassert itself. So yeah, there's a tantalizing possibility here that actually by avoiding intoxicants, or at least using them in extreme moderation and leaving enough time in between for the gremlins to hop off and for homeostasis to be restored, and by intentionally pursuing difficult things, physical and emotional, we can actually promote pleasure-pain resilience, increase dopamine levels, and again, widen our lens to be able to enjoy simpler, more modest rewards.
It's, I think, a big relief for somebody who is maybe staring down the barrel of, okay, I have to live without my thing now, whatever that is.
Right.
And how the heck am I ever going to feel good again?
Yes.
And the answer is that you can, but it just requires of you being able to, I guess in some senses, almost delay that gratification, but also subjecting yourself to something that is, as you said, fundamentally very uncomfortable. I have to tell you, you had this in the one of the chapters, one of your patients that you described who actually stopped, I believe it was cocaine, and he stopped using via taking these cold showers, first of all.
Right.
And then, of course, his addict brain being what it was like, I got to take this to the next level. I'm going to get the ice cubes in the bath and all of this stuff, which, I mean, I of course promptly tried. I was like, all right, well, I'm going to go take only the cold shower part. I didn't make it to the ice. I was like, I'm going to go take a cold shower and see how
he actually got a meat cooler. He got a meat cooler and he got a motor to circulate the water because that way it would keep it cooler. And
yeah, I love it. Yeah. And it really does. I mean, first of all, it was rough, I will say. And even if you just I did like a minute, but it really does actually work. I felt great for a couple of hours afterwards.
Isn't that great? Yeah. Wonderful.
And it's just amazing.
Yeah. No, you go ahead.
You go.
We both have so much to say.
Exactly.
I was going to say that you brought up a really important point, which comes up in clinical care all the time, which is that patients feel like either I continue to use my drug of choice or I'm going to be left in abject misery. Yeah. And so what my role becomes saying, no, there is a third way. There is a third way that is neither using nor abject misery. It's a third way in which you are practicing abstinence or extreme moderation, and you actually feel better than you have in a very, very long time. And holding that out to people is so important because, of course, when we're in our addiction, we cannot see that. It's like we literally have cognitive and sensory lack of access to that alternate reality. So really telling people like, this is for real. You have to believe me. It takes a leap of faith because I know you can't see it. And then you bring up the other really point is that, we can get addicted to pain. So if we press too hard and too fast on that pain side, that we can turn it into an intoxicant. For example, self-cutting is something that people do when we cut on ourselves, to relieve emotional, psychological distress. It totally works because it releases opioids. It literally releases our own endogenous opioids. And it just takes us out of our heads and puts us immediately in our bodies. But that's not what we're talking about here, right? That's not healthy or adaptive. We're talking about using mild to moderate doses in an incremental way and in a healthy and adaptive way.
Yeah, that's you were going to the same place that I was going to, because that was the other thought that ran through my head as soon as I saw this guy kind of taking it to the next level.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, this could definitely go to a whole other place, which
Right.
might not be healthy.
Right.
Yeah, I also think that going back to what we were talking about earlier around connection and vulnerability, that you're being able to show somebody this is what it looks like on the other side, and that there is this possibility, you lend so much more credence to that by actually going through that yourself. You say, look, I'm an example, and therefore I'm not just feeding you a line here,
Right.
that this is a reality, and that it's possible.
Yeah, the power of lived experience, right? And especially in this world of information overload and fake news, where you don't know what you can trust. If somebody has a lived firsthand experience of something, it does feel truer and realer than like a lot of other types of information. So yeah, I appreciate your saying that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious about what the reaction has been, if any, and as you kind of said earlier about maybe you're only hearing from sort of the people who are enjoying the book. But there's definitely in the beginning, there's this guy who really struggles with his masturbation issue, and he goes kind of through this elaborate stuff, which I was reading about, and I've had this kind of visceral experience with clients even sometimes too, on particular issues where you're like you're almost kind of, I don't want to say like there's some revulsion or something in there, but I think that I think that's what it is. And at the same time, and I mean, maybe this is a lot of what we're talking about as well, is that like I also felt really drawn into it. And this guy, first of all, in the the Audible version, you're reading the book, and I could just hear him in your voice. like he described that I think he was European or something, and I got this, and I also my initial reaction to that was like, whoa, that's really kind of out there. And then eventually I was so invested in him.
I know. He's such a wonderful man. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's great. You touch on a lot of different things, which is, of course, like what's going on in the therapist's own mind and heart and brain, when we take in this information. And yeah, I mean, we're people. We will have, real emotions, including sort of, kind of like revulsion or horror to some things that we hear, which is how I initially reacted to some of the things he was telling me. But then, in that moment, like reflecting on it, realized, well, that could have been me. That totally could have been me.
Exactly.
Circumstances slightly different, maybe a few tweaks here and there in sort of my upbringing or my environment or, my personality. Like I'm right there. And I think that was one of the things I really wanted to communicate with Dopamine Nation, is that addiction is not an otherness. It's not something that happens to other people over there. We are all vulnerable to this problem because we all have the same basic primitive wiring for processing pleasure and pain. And we all reflexively approach pleasure and avoid pain outside of conscious awareness or intent. And we live in a world in which we are constantly being tempted, encouraged, and in some ways even forced to consume. So of course, we're all struggling, with these problems of compulsive overconsumption. Some of us worse than others, but still, it's not like some freaky thing that we can't relate to.
Right, exactly. Even though it starts out feeling that way in that example in particular, that was definitely the takeaway message that I got as well. Is it's kind of like, what's your flavor?
Yeah, right. Yeah. And I call that chapter Our Masturbation Machines, because he literally makes a masturbation machine. But, what are our phones? I mean, those are masturbation machines, right? Like we don't need other people to answer any of our physical, emotional, cognitive needs. We can get it all from the phone. So I really do think it's some kind of very serious tipping point.
Do you notice in your clinical practice as well? It's just something that I've been seeing a lot of, even more so throughout the course of the pandemic, and particularly recently, the struggle around parenting with screen time and
Oh,
having to
oh,
manage is
oh
just
God,
like,
it's
this
a
is like,
nightmare.
it's
It's a
the
nightmare.
issue, I feel like, parenting wise of our time,
Yes,
and
yes.
no one knows what to do with it.
No, it's true. It's true. Yeah. And we've got the same struggles with our kids. Now, what I will say is we kept our house tech free for like the first 10 to 15 years of our kids' lives. We literally had no Wi-Fi to
Wow.
our house. And that was wonderful and so much easier than it is now, where
Yeah.
we've got Wi-Fi. All of our kids have devices,
Yeah.
including phones, which they got for themselves, which they're paying for themselves because they're teenagers, and
Mm-hmm.
we have no control over them anymore.
Yep.
And yet I'm so grateful for the early time where we, did other things, right? And I mean, I feel very privileged too, frankly, to have been able to do that, because not everybody can. Some people,
Sure.
that's all they can do, to just like keep their kid occupied on a device while they work or
Yep.
whatever it
Yep.
is.
Mm-hmm.
But oh gosh, what a struggle. And that's, one of the main reasons I mean, as you may have noticed, well, maybe you couldn't have known that, but I dedicated Dopamine Nation to my kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I did that on purpose, because I am very much thinking about this, the younger generation and the world that they are inheriting, and what on earth they're going to do with it and where it's going to lead. And so Dopamine Nation is sort of my way of saying, here are some things, you can do to protect yourself in this dopamine overloaded world that, has us all kind of going down this garden path, which is not a place we want to go.
Yeah. And it's, as you said, some people may have been forced into doing things that they didn't really want to do because they had no choice when the kids are at home all day and we're in lockdown and quarantine. And it's kind of like, what are you going to do? So it's kind of no fault of their own. I feel like sometimes parents feel sort of like sheepish coming in and like, well, we got them a laptop, and I'm like, oh yeah, I mean, that's, you had to do their schoolwork supposedly,
right,
and it's so difficult. But I'm hopeful with the younger generation that there's a lot of things happening, especially we kind of touched on earlier, around stigma, lack thereof, in terms of mental health. I think also in terms of addiction, and in a lot of ways, there are a lot of really young, sober people now, which I'm just like blown away by.
Right. So cool. Yeah. And there are also there's the collegiate recovery movement, which is a movement for people in recovery from addiction on college campuses. Stanford just started something called the Well House, which is actually a whole residential unit for people in recovery and other people who do not want to use substances. So I feel like the whole recovery movement is it's resonating for people, even people who are not, aren't meeting classic criteria for addiction. This kind of awareness that there's got to be something better and more out there than just constantly consuming, and how can I find those types of social goods that my psyche is craving. And so I'm hopeful about that.
Yeah, me too. And I think there's maybe some doubt being cast on this whole idea of that college is this Animal House experience, and everyone just gets wasted all the time, and that is just sort of a stereotypical fantasy. It's not necessarily reality, and you can choose to. I'll say to kids a lot of time who are going off to school that you can pick the people that you want to hang out with. They're out there.
They certainly are. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, this normalization that occurs when we're using substances in an addictive way, we affiliate with other people using substances in an addictive way. We tell ourselves the whole world is doing that, when it's not remotely true.
Right.
But I think even just on college campuses, the way this alternative lifestyle, it's ridiculous to call it alternative because probably it's the majority, but a non-using way of recreating and being together and socializing. It's become, people are more aware of it on campuses, and that's really hopeful and exciting.
Yeah. So what would you want to say to any therapists who might be listening to this, who are struggling to just sort of push through some issue that they're not necessarily an addiction issue, but certainly potentially could be that. As we've said, everyone has that kind of capability and is hardwired for it. Anything that you would want people to take away from this as mental health practitioners?
Yeah, I like the framework of life as an experiment. And one of the best ways to figure out how biological systems work is to change something in that system. And so I really do promote in my book, and I would, promote this among your listeners, as well as to kind of think about what is that substance or behavior that I have a conflicted relationship, that I use more of than I want, that I may be hiding a little bit of, that's contrary to my values. And once you figure out what that thing is, set a quit date and abstain for 30 days. 30 days is not that much, in a lifetime. And do it as a kind of experiment, a way to change your biological system and see what comes out. Recognize that you'll probably feel horrible in the first 2 weeks because you'll be in withdrawal. And again, universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance: anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and craving. But if you can get to weeks 3 or 4, the light might really come on and you might really go, wow, I feel better. Even if I wasn't aware of feeling bad, or even if I didn't think I was really addicted, but I feel better. And of course, we're always trying to, micro change our experience to optimize the way that we feel. That's just fundamental, right? That's what our big brains are in service of. And so it's the abstinence model, the pressing on the pain side. These are countercultural messages, but I do think that they are the path to a more flourishing life. And so that's what I would recommend.
Well, thank you so much for that. And I also I certainly would recommend the book. Obviously, I really did enjoy it. I remember that I had, it's funny looking back on it now. I remember when I picked it up to read it and I had this little twinge of kind of like, maybe I don't want to read this.
Yes, right. I know. I've heard that. Someone wrote some review and said that lady really scares me. I'm like, oh dear.
Well, I mean, that's that part, I think, that is clinging on to what is making, this is going to force me to really look at the stuff and myself, even being in recovery and abstaining from all these other things. It's not like I'm immune from not look at my phone or something.
Right. No, I know if it's not one thing, it's another, right? That whack-a-mole problem.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I really did appreciate everything that we have kind of touched on in terms of your honesty and vulnerability, and it just really allowed that message to come home. And so I just want to thank you for giving us all this gift of the book, and I'm hopeful that that's helpful for a lot of people.
Oh, thank you. That was so nice.
Well, it's true. I also appreciate your time certainly coming on, and hopefully that kind of, gets the message out to more people.
Yeah, awesome. Happy to be here. Great conversation. Nice questions.
All right, that was Anna Lembke. Her website is annalemke.com. Once again, the latest book is Dopamine Nation, and you can get that wherever books are sold. Also, don't forget to check out all of the offerings that we have available now for practice growth. The website is growingthepractice.com. And until next time, as always, be well and be in touch.
This podcast is not intended as medical or psychological treatment. In no way should it replace treatment from a mental health professional.